What is up, ladies and gentlemen? I'm finally starting a new series. This time I'm going to be talking about much more along the lines of just movement and mechanics when it comes to the sport of powerlifting and how we squat, bench press, and deadlift. So obviously last time I did a lot of just kind of beginner programming stuff. This time, obviously, I want to do a bit of an introduction similarly to how my whole programming series was. This time I'm just going to wrap it up to one video so we can really start kind of rolling into, I guess I want to call it like a myth-breaking series. I just feel like there's so many just cues and just things that are taught within the sport that are just so improper and wrong. But I want to be able to basically give us a good just background of like, here's some very simple mechanics, biomechanics rules that can really help us discern whether something is actually viable or not. So what I really want to do is kind of give us a checklist or just basically teach us about three very important rules, just about very, very fundamental ideas of how our muscles function. And if we can really kind of refer back to these three things and knowing how a muscle is going to function most, I guess, optimally, what can that actually mean whenever we're trying to implement a certain cue or implement a certain type of form, and what that actually will look like whenever we bring it down to the muscle's actual finite biomechanical level and seeing what's going to actually happen when we introduce it. And then just kind of using that logic and always kind of having that nice information on the back of our hand, we can go back and just see if something is, once again, truly viable. So, and obviously, before I dive into these three things I'm really wanting to cover, there is so much that can be discussed when it comes to not just anatomy, but kinesiology and biomechanics that people get whole degrees in. And obviously, I'm not going to sit here and try and make hours and hours and hours of educational stuff to teach you guys. Neither do I know all of that, but that's why I really want to kind of bring it down to these three things to make it to where, hey, we can have this nice little, I guess, checklist, you could call it, to make sure that whatever we're trying to learn or implement within powerlifting, does it truly make sense or not? So unfortunately, this first one is going to be, I'd say, the most complex, but I do feel like it is the most important because it's going to be just how the muscle is operating at its smallest structure and just in its entirety. And that's going to be how the muscle actually contracts. And like I said, this is a very, very complex idea and a very complex topic, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible and not try to get too crazy with it. That way we can get the gist of it and move on. So what we have, it's called the sliding filament theory. I know, I'm already saying the word theory and stuff like that. But really all it is just how the muscle at its smallest fibers, what it actually does in order to contract and to shorten and to lengthen. And what we have is basically at the smallest part of our muscle, we have what's called a myofibril. That's the smallest fiber possible. And within that, there's a lot of proteins. There's two particular ones that we're trying to look at, and that is the actin and the myosin. And once again, try not to make this overly complicated, but this is so important and just how the muscle actually functions. It is these actin, these tiny little proteins, they're grabbing onto this long myosin filament and kind of pulling themselves along it. My favorite analogy I've heard to refer this to is kind of act like it's a ratchet system. So like obviously if we don't have the rope very far inside the ratchet, it doesn't have a whole lot of leverage yet. But if we have that ratchet system all the way tightened down, we can't really get any more rope pulled through, right? So that's the same way that actin acts on that myosin. To where if there's not much in it, we don't have a whole lot of strength. So if the muscle's very long and the actin has not grabbed very much of that myosin yet, we don't have very much power right there. But then the same could be said whenever we have a muscle already fully shortened and we've grabbed all that rope, we've grabbed all that myosin to where now we don't have any leverage also. So all that leverage and all of our muscle strength really lies within that mid-range for the muscle. So whenever it's not fully shortened or it's not fully lengthened, it doesn't have to be specifically at its halfway point or, going for some crazy Joel Seedman 90 degrees. But it's very important to know what might happen if we were forcibly trying to make a muscle too short, or just what might happen if we were trying to make a muscle longer, even if it's just for the rules of the sport. Like say if, we have somebody with long femurs and a long torso trying to go deep in a squat to actually hit depth and make some side judges happy. Because in turn, if we are making those, say those hip extensors, our glute max and our hamstrings, if we're making them very, very long to where they don't have much leverage, other musculature might have to come into play to actually help us start going the hip extension. That's why some people, I'd say, see a decent amount of that kind of knee valgus in a squat. It's just their adductors are helping assist the glute max and the hamstrings. And that's a whole other topic for another day, but still a very, very good example for what I'm discussing right now. So the takeaway from that is if a muscle is very long, it's not going to have a lot of power. If a muscle is very, very short, it's not going to be able to contract very well either because it's already fully contracted and it's done everything it can do. So it's something that we need to be very mindful with whenever we're trying to force a cue or force a position of how that might change the lift and might be beneficial or might not be beneficial at all. All right, so we've gotten that big hairy topic out of the way. The next two are much more simple and easier to grasp, I promise. So up next, we're going to discuss actual antagonists versus agonists. So very simple here. It's just literally if we're looking at a joint action or just any sort of movement within the body, there's going to always be a group of agonists, the muscles that are helping promote the movement. There's going to be the antagonists, the muscles that are in charge of the opposite movement. And basically, let's say if we're looking at, something as simple as the elbow again. If we're looking at, flexion of the elbow, that's going to be our bicep. If we're looking at extension, that's going to be our tricep. So if we really bring it back around to just, hey, let's focus on elbow flexion, just bending the elbow in, using that bicep, a bicep curl. If that bicep is working, in order for that to actually happen, the antagonist every time has to relax. It has to lengthen. If it does not do that, then that function won't be able to happen. Same thing for the tricep. For it to actually extend the elbow, that bicep has to fully relax and has to lengthen. And this is all very important to notate because if we're trying to cue something that shouldn't be cued, if we're trying to forcibly cue the biceps during a bench press or something like that, sure, the bicep's going to be there to help stabilize the shoulder joint, but if we're trying to flex it and trying to contract it, we will never be able to go fully into that bench press. Or another even better one that I kind of refer to is we're too focused on, say, scapular retraction of the bench press. We're trying to pinch those scaps too much, especially going into a lockout where there has to be some degree of protraction to fully do it, just because that tricep attaches the scapula, as well as those pecs are in charge, and a lot of the anterior muscles are in charge of protraction to fully lock out that barbell. If we're trying to forcibly retract that, we're not going to fully get that lockout because we're going to be sitting there with soft elbows. So if you've ever had issues with soft elbows, could be an overly retraction thing, could be a lot of things. But once again, a very viable just example for why this is something we need to look at and something we'll use way in the future to actually talk about this topic more. All right, so that was much more simple, right? Not near as bad as some crazy sliding filament type stuff. The last one's not too bad either. It's going to be just discussing attachment sites for joints. Once again, this is an insanely crucial one because we're going to really be able to figure out a muscle's primary function and main function if we just look at where it attaches and what happens if that muscle actually brings those attachment sites together. Obviously, I'd say it's a little too simple a way to summarize it because we have two main types of actual attachments. We have monoarticular, meaning that it just attaches to one joint, or we have polyarticular, where it attaches to more than one. So once again, the easiest way to look at this is if we look at obviously the origin and the insertion, we can see what happens to the joints and what happens whenever we bring those two things together. So a very simple one that I have right in front of me is going to be the pecs. So that pec originates right here kind of on the ribs and on the front of the chest, and it attaches to that humerus. So if we bring those two together and contract that pec, we know that it's going to help us with that humeral adduction. It's going to help bring that in and help us lock out some good bench presses. So typically looking at the function of a monoarticular joint is very plain and simple. We know exactly what's going to happen. But once again, this gives us a very proper expectation of a muscle. So if we know that, hey, it only attaches to these spots right here, what happens when we bring them together? And that's our function. So if we ever expect anything way grander than that from the pec, then we might need to have a little bit of, other insight or just maybe look at it as not a viable option because it's just something that pec isn't truly capable of. But here's where there does get to be a little bit of, not necessarily confusion, but just it gets to be more complicated when we start looking at the polyarticular joints. This is where a muscle can potentially help be a very powerful stabilizer. So say if we look at the bicep, it's going to be way up on not just the humerus, but it also attaches to the clavicle. So we have 2 points of origin up here, and it's going to go all the way down and insert on the actual forearm. So obviously, it helps us with that bicep curl, because it's going to help bring that bicep up. But since we have these two attachment sites here, it's not going to always be yanking that shoulder down to it as well or trying to pull that to it. So what that means, it can actually help stabilize that shoulder girdle. That's where a lot of, I think, the confusion on stabilizer muscles come into play as well, is that people think there's very small particular muscles that are always there to help out with stabilization, when in reality, if something's going to be a polyarticular muscle joint, it's going to help out with stabilization a lot of the time. Once again, there gets to be a lot of confusion that, hey, our shoulder stabilizers are just external rotators or just serratus. But no, even a muscle like the bicep is a very, very crucial sort of shoulder stabilizer. And that's why if you do a lot of heavy bench presses, if you're kind of overreaching your level of fitness and fatigue there, and you're starting to see a lot of overload when it comes to training, that's where you'll start seeing, you get a lot of that bicep tendinopathy. And that's why you have a lot of that shoulder pain, or a lot of that bicep pain, and a lot of that elbow pain. Alright, so obviously a rather quick video compared to some of the other ones, but I'm trying to aim for that. So we have 3 very important things that we can dive into each and every video on any time that we're trying to basically look into a cue or look into something that's trying to be taught with form and see if it's a good option or not. So number 1, the muscles, how they contract. Are we putting that muscle in a powerful position or not? Is it going to be too short? Is it going to be too long? Or do we even just need to look at like what might be happening because of, for us trying to meet the rules of the sport, are we getting a muscle to be in a lengthened position to where it's not optimal, to where other things might happen, and we might need to be okay with those. Number 2, agonist versus antagonist. Are we just getting a muscle to actually do what it needs to do, and that might be just lengthening and relaxing so that the other muscles can do their proper joint action. And then 3, those attachment sites. Once again, making it as easy as possible. Just, hey, let's look at where a muscle is, where does it attach, and what happens whenever that muscle contracts between those attachment sites. Simple enough, right? So moving forward, I'm going to start actually picking out very, very specific cues, or just things that people, quote unquote, might even demonize in the sport, thinking it might be a pretty bad thing, whenever it might just be something that needs to happen in order to meet the rules of the sport. So if you guys have any questions about this, obviously hit me up, ask in the comments, or if you have something that you're very curious about in relation to all this when it comes to, hey, I've always been told to do this in my squat. What do you think? I'll gladly talk about it and see what's good.